Dr. Tony Matthews, you're back.
I am back from the US.
Back from the US. Good to have you back as well. Jason Byrne, Associate Professor that you are. Welcome.
Thank you, Matt.
You don't take holidays.
No, we don't. We haven't had many holidays this year, have we, Tony?
No, it's been a holiday-free year.
Here for Urban Squeeze this afternoon, and an interesting topic too, talking about heritage value on the Gold Coast, heritage buildings on the Gold Coast. Is there any? What are they? Where are they? This is very topical, and Tim Ross, one half of Merrick and Rosso, put a little series together recently that you may have seen called Streets of Our Town, which kind of bemoaned the lack of heritage value in modern architecture, and insight into what he was talking about.
We're building the biggest homes in the world. McMansions. They're supersized and we're loving them.
So I came straight in through your garage door. Do you actually use your front door at all?
No. What does that say about the way we live today? Back in the 50s and 60s, and even the 70s when I was a kid, we had small homes with big backyards. The Australian quarter-acre dream. It was modernism. It was the golden age of experimental design. And we built some of the best homes in the world. But somewhere along the way, we got lost. We've gone from modernism to McMansion.
McMansionism, perhaps, could apply here to the Gold Coast. Jason Byrne, Tony Matthews, have at it.
Yeah.
Heritage buildings on the Gold Coast.
Look, I think McMansionism definitely applies on the Gold Coast. It's almost like a kind of chronic disease that we've got at the moment. I love this Tim Ross show.
Yeah.
I'm a child of the 70s, having grown up in the 70s, born in just at the very tail end of the 60s, 69.
Indeed, I'm just thinking his shirt here says it
It
all.
does, doesn't
I know
it?
the listeners can't see
the
it.
plaid trousers.
It's got
and
quite a collar.
Yeah.
I'm thinking Graham Kennedy blankety blanks.
Oh,
It's got
mate,
a bit of that
I've even
going
got
on.
the brown and orange tie that goes with it. It's
He
just
does,
joy.
I've seen it.
Yeah. So,
You've
I
just
think,
gone up in estimation, in my view.
Thank you. And the leather jacket, right? So
Yes.
I think Tim Ross is on something here. He's talking about a period in Australia where we were embracing our own identity. We were talking about a unique kind of suburb, a particularly Australian kind of suburb, with a yard where you could kick a footy and play cricket and the kids could muck around. And, we were bold. We embarked on our own architecture. And what we've got now, you used the word crap to describe the
The traffic situation.
We've got crap architecture as well, don't we, Tony? It's really kind of worrying.
Yeah, I think, and Jason's getting at a good point, and Tim Ross mentioned it, and he was right, is that there was a time, not too long ago, where a lot of people actually did engage an architect to design their own house, and they generally don't anymore. Houses are bought more or less off plan, like you'd buy a car. You've got large development companies, they're developing new suburbs, and you choose which house style you want on your lot, and they'll put it in, and it's all sort of, half done already. And so what it's done is it's taken that craft and that focus on design to some degree out of the development process, and we're all losing because of that.
Yeah, interesting too, how he mentioned a smaller house on a bigger block, or not a house not occupying as much of the block back then. Of course, that meant that there would have been a saving made because there wasn't as much construction. So money perhaps being dumped in at the front end, at the design end, to make something serviceable, functional, but to encompass, that quarter acre that we've craved for years now.
Right. And, post-war, there was an amazing kind of service that he talks about in this show where architects got together and came up with a series of plans and released them for £5, he said. It's not a lot of money. You can imagine now paying $20 or $30 and having access to all these plans. And then you could get your builder to take an architect design plan and build it. These didn't take up as much of the lot, as you pointed out. So many of the issues we've raised here in the show about heat island effects and noise and these kind of things weren't a problem because the house wasn't taking up as much of the lot. Kids could muck around in the backyard, Tony. There were lots of benefits.
There were lots of benefits. Now, one of the trends that we have seen in recent times is people are buying slightly smaller lots and they're building bigger houses, and that's taking up more of the lot. So that's one issue, that the lots are smaller. But also there's a real change in people's tastes and preferences now, and what people see as being necessary to have in a family home for it to be fully functional and appropriate to their needs. And that means more space now than it used to. It means more active living space or more adaptable living space. Increasingly, we've been seeing things like the emergence of the home cinema, however necessary that actually is debatable, but we're seeing it.
Garages for 8 cars.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
There's so many home cinemas with people watching television on their phones. That's the thing that,
hilarious. But I think what's interesting is, when we think about heritage, we think about the built form of the past, or buildings or areas that were built in the past, and that we want to preserve them now because they have some value for us. And when you look at things like the modern McMansion and the contemporary suburbs we're building, the real question about them is, will they ever have any heritage value in the future? Will people look back on them in 40 or 50 years and say, well, these are the glory days of the 2010s. We should be, and my feeling is probably not.
And, this is
there's a disposability.
Yeah.
Isn't there?
But this
Knock it down, start again.
This is kind of a point that you raised, though, Matt, when we were just talking before, is on the Gold Coast, we've got these beach shacks that were built in the 50s and 60s. They were, many of them, do-it-yourself, right? They emulated the kind of modernist designs that we saw in the US at the time, with skillion roofs and butterfly roofs and crazy windows, really amazing architecture. But they were put up using durabestos, which is essentially just asbestos cladding and a wood frame, and people would build them themselves. Over time, they took on a real value. Kids would holiday in them. I'm sure you've holidayed in them. Yeah. I holidayed in them.
There's
right,
a fabulous example just down the street here. We're on Francis Street. You know the very one that is. It's boxed in by high rise everywhere and stands alone as a beacon to an almost forgotten time.
To a different age, right?
Different age, yeah.
And like Tony's saying, this kind of heritage is not just the built form. It's about a little bit like a nostalgia, but it's about the kind of the spirit of the age, the kinds of things that were thought about at the time, the ideas, the moments, right?
Yeah, I recently described it, actually. I've written a bit about heritage recently, and I recently described it as heritage being about real and imagined value.
Explain.
So you've got the real value, as in you can say, well, this is a particular type of architecture, there's a particular vernacular form here, for example, so there's a real value. But there's also the imagined value, which is the kind of the psychological investment that we place in...
Sentiment,
exactly. So you look back at these beach shacks, or Jason does, or I look back at the equivalent places in Ireland, and I think, wow, I had such a happy time there as a childhood, and you remember all the good stuff, and that's the imagined value.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different, it's no less relevant, but it's separate from the real value, in inverted commas. So heritage is really about the interplay between the real and the imagined value, and what we really have to be careful not to do is sort of overprotect
romanticize
things, and romanticize, and it's a contentious issue. Some people will say we protect too much, some people say we protect too little. It's one of these really tricky things. It's very hard to find a simple path through the middle.
To be definitive. 91.7 ABC Gold Coast. Urban Squeeze with Associate Professor Jason Byrne and Dr. Tony Matthews with me. Can I share with you something that I found kind of amusing?
Please.
Well, I knew we were talking about heritage today, so I always go looking for a bit of audio to set the scene. I found this.
This worth a living just because.
Are you familiar with the work of the heritage singers?
No.
They're fabulous. Sorry, I just had to share it. It was there.
But you know what this reminds me
I
of?
really like them. They're
was
wearing shirts like yours in
They
that
are
film clip,
classic
Jason.
shirts. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Matt, but there's a clip on YouTube of the 1970s. It's promoting the Gold Coast in the 1970s. I come to the Gold Coast. It starts off with a guy looking out the window of his aircraft and, the Gold Coast is huge now. It's got 50,000 people and this kind of stuff, right? But it's got that music.
Yes.
And it shows these kinds of buildings of the time. And we've lost a lot of them on the Gold Coast. In fact, we lost Iluka recently. It was one of the earliest skyscrapers right on that shoreline in Surfers Paradise. And I think it's one of the buildings that featured in that promotional video. You come to the Gold Coast and see our audacious, brash kind of architecture and this sort of stuff. And it's been obliterated. It's gone.
So what do we have on the Gold Coast that is of significant heritage value? I know there's some older buildings. I mentioned the beach shack down the road. There's a few of them sprinkling around the place.
There's a few of them, but they're not heritage listed yet.
No, okay.
So they could be lost, right? And it's kind of odd to think about it, but maybe we should be heritage listing some of these beach shacks, like the one down the road, right? Because it's got architectural value and it embraces the period, this kind of stuff.
Not sure how the owners who've probably been banking on it not being heritage listed might.
Well, Tony, do you want to take up that point?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and that's something I've covered off on in the past in some of my own writing. We were talking about this before the show.
We were.
A lot of people are very, very cautious about a heritage designation, or they don't want one applied to their house, or they don't want to buy a house that has one, or they don't want anything to do with heritage designation, because they fear, and sometimes they accurately fear, that it's going to result in a whole heap of extra regulation that they're going to have to keep to if they ever want to do any further development work or redevelopment work, that it's going to interfere with their private property rights, that it's going to increase their maintenance costs, that they're going to have to replace like with like. For example, if you've got, a particular type of roof tile, you're going to have to reinstate that very type of roof. So a lot of people get very antsy about the idea that their property would be heritage listed, or that they would live, and this is another trend we're seeing in heritage, is in a heritage designated area. So up until the 1960s, generally what we tended to do, and I'm talking about globally, the heritage focus tended to be on individual buildings, and from about the 60s onwards it started to broaden out to what we call the ensemble scale, so like the district level, so maybe a whole street or a whole series of streets.
Okay.
Now it's easier to protect the fine fabric of an individual building, but if you're trying to conserve an ensemble area, you have to be a little bit more flexible. But the idea is that the area as a whole, and all of the things that are in it, and all of the functions that it has, and all of the social and cultural history that it has, as well as the physical history, all intermingles to create a larger piece of heritage. Now, that's a trend that's not yet arrived fully formed in this country, and not so much to my knowledge on the Gold Coast, but important to keep in mind that the Gold Coast really only started to develop in any meaningful sense after the Second World War. So what really matters here is preserving those buildings that Jason was talking about, the stuff that was built in the 50s and 60s, and if we're not preserving that now in 2016, then arguably we're doing ourselves a disservice.
We'll be looking at old photos and going, how quaint.
Look what we lost. There's some examples. So we do have a local heritage register here. There's an act in 1992, the Queensland Heritage Act, which sets up kind of criteria or standards for identifying what should be preserved. So the Southport Town Hall, for example, right? In Southport, that's an example. Next door, the old ambulance station. Yep. The former Tallabudgera post office. Which
Yes, know it. Yep.
Yeah, it looks very broken down, but there's a reason for that. The former Kira High School. Right? So interestingly, in the Kira High School, they've done something called adaptive reuse, where it's now become a community centre.
Yeah.
So they've kept much of the fabric of the building, but they've had to adapt some of the insides.
We've broadcast from there before, outside broadcasts in years gone by.
Right,
Bleach
really
Festival
groovy building.
and whatnot, yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the Tallabudgera Post Office, on the other hand, they tried to leave that as intact as they could. So there's this idea of preservation versus restoration, like the Kira High School, or maybe even reuse or reconstruction. So in the case of the old Southport Town Hall, that's been reused for sort of startup businesses and .com kind of enterprises and that kind of stuff, and a kind of flexible office space, and it's working really, really well, right? But Tony and I were talking before about how you can land up with a kind of Disneyland effect if you're not careful, not just in these heritage precincts, but what happens if someone goes in and knocks down one of these buildings, like the pub in Melbourne?
In Melbourne, I was about to say, because you see this experience in other cities, specifically in Melbourne at the moment, absolute outrage and outcry when a developer has quite bullishly
violated the rules
because the punishment, doesn't really fit.
It's
the
a line
crime.
item on a ledger, right? It's like we'll cop the fine. But Tony, they're going to be made to reinstate that, right?
So we understand this. I believe the state planning minister has reached down and said that particular the owners of that building who knocked it down will have to reinstate it brick by brick. And the point that Jason is getting at is that it's not the same building.
No,
it might look the same, but it's not. I mean,
it's like a Disneyland coffee.
So you run the risk of ending up with a pastiche.
Yeah, a pastiche. Oh, it's a harsh word.
Simulacra, we call it in the academy, which is even worse, right? But it's
Say that again.
Simulacra. It's where the fake becomes more real than the real thing.
Oh, gosh.
So people who go to Disneyland, for example, reveling in Disneyland and not realising that they're living inside this kind of theme park.
We were talking about post-truth earlier on in the program as well.
Idea.
We're entering an urban planning post-truth kind of phase here.
Yeah, but you might be amazed about the kinds of things that can be heritage listed. So bridges. The first concrete bridge in Queensland, for example, is heritage listed. That was built in the 20s, I think, from memory. Lighthouses, bathing pavilions, like we've seen in Southport and Main Beach. Individual houses we talk about, obviously, but factories, cemeteries, individual headstones, dams, gardens, right, Tony? There's a whole bunch of
gardens,
things we talk about.
Street furniture, railings, manhole covers, walls, anything can be heritage listed.
Stairs.
Stairs. So it's important to think in heritage terms, not just about the full building or a larger area, but actually just the fine details of the urban fabric.
Yeah.
Like, I'll give you a story from my hometown. One of the main streets, there's sort of two main streets in my hometown, or two main shopping streets, if you will. And one of them has a huge wrought iron column in it. It's about 1 meter high, and for years I wondered what it was, and eventually it was explained to me it was actually an old mooring post, because that street once upon a time was a canal, and ships used to come up there.
Wow.
So that has remained in situ. The street's filled in, the canal is long gone, it's culverted over, but right in the middle of the sidewalk is this giant mooring post from the 17th century. So, the city has evolved and built on and modernized and kept up with the times, but there's a heritage value in that one single piece of urban fabric, and that's preserved.
And you can find it in Perth too, right?
Yeah.
So there's even old mooring anchors and that kind of stuff on the buildings, which are now miles back from the river because they've done all this kind of infill. And we were just talking before about one of the other travesties is something called facadism. Have you heard of that, Matt?
No, I have not.
So basically what happens, and I saw this happen in Perth when I was growing up, Alan Bond bought the Old Palace Hotel, beautiful hotel, and decided to erect his kind of memorial for his great empire that he had. So they gutted the hotel and stuck up the Bond Tower through the middle of it,
But left the facade
but left
there.
the facade.
This happens in Melbourne as well. You see
Right.
a lot of this. Yeah.
Yeah, known as facadism.
I don't like facadism.
They've actually taken it even further in the UK. There's a heritage theme park, for want of a better thing. So what they've done is they've preserved all these building facades and they've moved them to this park, and then they've just braced them with struts, and you can walk around and look at the facades of these once glorious buildings, because that's all that remains.
Yeah.
Do the selfies in front. Look, I was in the 18th century. Yeah.
Is there a best way then? Is there a best practice for preserving interesting and relevant pieces of the past?
Yeah, great question. So it comes from Australia, actually. So we've had the kind of International Council on Monuments and Sites, ICOMOS it's called, and Australia signed up to this kind of international convention, a World Heritage Convention in 1974. ICOMOS followed up, and then there was this Borough Charter, it's called, in 1979. And that's really, when you think about it, it's really when we started to go, hang on, we've had this breakneck growth. Do we need to slow down and start saving stuff? And in there, the Borough Charter set up some guidelines and best practices, which are now world-renowned for the kind of criteria they use. So the site must be of cultural or social importance, or scientific importance, or aesthetic importance, or architectural importance. Has to represent a kind of evolution of history, like the growth of Queensland, for example, something that might be rare or uncommon or endangered, or provide information about our history and our past, have a strong association for cultural or spiritual reasons, aesthetic significance, or strong associations even for a person, right, Tony? So in your town, there's sites that specifically remembered for a particular person too.
Oh yeah,
Like an author or an artist?
Yeah,
or
so for
something like that.
example, Frank O'Connor, the very famous Irish short story writer, Frank O'Connor House, which was his old house, his old home, is fully preserved and has been brought up to modern standard in terms of its electrics and things like that, but still more or less looks as it did back in his day. And there's a literature centre in there now.
Yeah, okay.
So, so even something like that, or something that they do a lot in Ireland is they'll put a plate on the front of a house. Like the last house I lived in Ireland before I moved to this country, my neighbour directly across the lane from me, we were living in terraces, she had a plate put in the front of her house that was the house so the first immigrant to pass through Ellis Island was a young girl called Annie Moore, and that was the house Annie Moore used to live in. So it has a certain heritage value. In terms of it has a heritage value locally, but it also has a heritage value somewhere else, because this is the first person that ever moved through Ellis Island, and so name plating is very common as well in Ireland. I'm not sure.
I remember Amsterdam, there was Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, had the same kind
Yeah,
of
of
deal
course,
going.
yeah.
So again, it's like what was clever with this example you've talked about is they've done some upgrades to bring it up to current design requirements, up to code, as we would say, but still kind of retaining the fabric. The University of Western Sydney's done this. They've got some of Australia's oldest heritage buildings on that campus, and again they've kind of repurposed them for things like the Gough Whitlam Museum there.
Well, they'd be old colonial type
They
buildings.
are. Right,
Yeah.
they're beautiful old buildings. So again, trying as hard as you can to protect the fabric, but not turn it into like a theme park or something like that. Still be
Indeed.
able to live with it. and
Just going
use it.
through some of the items that you mentioned on that list there are so many of them that would apply to the culture of the Gold Coast as a holiday destination, as a surfing destination. I was almost going, oh yeah, tick, beach shack, tick, tick, tick,
All of
because they're the archetypical memories that have pretty much established the cultural relevance of this part of the world.
Yeah, and there's a little building that's kind of won my heart. You've talked about a building just down the
Yeah.
road here. So on First Avenue and Broadbeach, just opposite the Crown Plaza Hotel, where the old El Dorado Motel used to be, right? Remember
The
all
El
the motels?
Dorado,
So
yep.
amazing.
Yeah.
Is a 1949 designed architecture design house. It's kind of falling into the ground. It's slowly rotting and crumbling. And it's just begging for someone to buy it. But it's 1.8 million is what it was listed for a few years back. Who's got that kind of coin? It's hard with heritage to purchase these places, and then secondly, work out how to restore them, and then how you might use them.
Yeah.
So again, it could be adaptively reused as a cafe or a little motel or that kind of stuff. You could fill it full of mid-century furniture and all that kind of thing. But it needs someone to champion that.
But it also sounds like a good example of what we touched on before, which is the people being wary of heritage buildings, because if you want to do anything with them, it costs more, it takes longer, you have to go through more regulation, jump through more hoops, and people just go, you know what, this isn't worth it, and then we all lose out. But that's kind of part of the process. So as I said earlier, it's really hard to find a good way through the middle of all of this.
Interesting topic, gentlemen. We're out of time as usual. Good on you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Urban Squeeze for another week.